You're listening to Hackers to Founders with Chris Magistrato.
You're going to make a mistake. Somebody's going to misunderstand what you were asking for. There's going to be problems. But ideally, you've introduced enough things downstream that if everything goes to hell, you've got some kind of recourse for coming back from it.
This is Hackers to Founders, a podcast about cybersecurity professionals who have reached the pinnacle of their cybersecurity expertise and have ventured into new frontiers, whether it's launching innovative startups or making impactful investments in our industry. My name is Chris Magistrato, and I'm a vulnerability researcher best known for traveling and meeting hackers from all around the world. And I'm using what little extrovert skills I have to introduce to you hackers that are changing the world. All right. Welcome to Hackers to Founders. Today, we are excited to welcome an accomplished cybersecurity executive and entrepreneur whose career has spanned some of the most critical areas in application security, vulnerability management, and leadership. John Terrill is currently the Chief Information Security Officer at Phosphorus Cybersecurity, where he leads efforts to tackle ex-IoT security challenges. John's career is marked by impactful roles, including serving as CISO for a prominent organization such as Fox News and Point72, founding Drawbridge Networks, later acquired by OPEC Networks, and co-founding companies like TrueState and Zetaset. A former professor at NYU Polytech, John is a passionate advocate for education and cybersecurity. With multiple patents and a deep technical background, he combines innovation with practical expertise to advance the field. Please join me in welcoming John Terrill to Hackers to Founders. John, welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks for having me.
And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And if you're on Spotify, please give us 5 stars. Thanks. Pleasure to have you. So, we'd like to open up and learn a little bit more about, your childhood. And this is a new question that I'm adding to the mix. What was the coolest thing in your world at that time when you were growing up?
Where do I start? I think I took apart every device that was in my parents' house and then didn't put it back together properly.
I don't think none of us did.
So I got kind of uniquely lucky in kind of getting into the cybersecurity world because I grew up in Atlanta, about a mile from a place called Lenox Mall. And when I was about 12, I ended up walking up because I was kind of a mall rat as a kid, but was into computers and didn't have a ton of direction to it. But I was fortunate that the local 2600 meeting was at Lenox Mall on the first Friday of every month. So,
excellent.
Having read 2600s and I found a Borders or something that you could buy for the quarterly, I was like, all right, cool. I'm going to go up there and check it out. And I didn't know what anybody looked like. I had just gotten onto an MC channel for it. And I just happened to be behind 2 guys in line at the food court. And one was wearing a CDC, Ninja Strike Force shirt. And I was like, there's no coincidence, right? This is Atlanta in the late 90s. These guys have to be here for 2600. And it turned out that they were Georgia Tech students, and that was their first time there. And they invited me to hang out with them. And more than 25 years later, I'm still friends with them.
Beautiful. CDC, you're talking about Cult of the Dead Cow, right? Not the Center for Disease Control. Right, yeah.
No, which also is in Atlanta. So I can see how that could be a little confusing.
Were they part of CDC?
So one of them was, yeah. Yeah.
And how was that first meeting? Did you get to meet a bunch of people? Were you nervous?
I mean, I was 12. I was nervous. I'm still nervous all the time meeting new people.
Sure.
You get to talking to folks and you start showing up, and over time you get to know people. I built a lot of kind of lifelong friendships there, and got really, really lucky because a couple years later, I was 12 when I started going 2600, and then when I was 15, I got recruited onto the X-Force at Internet Security Systems.
I would love to hear more about that. It was acquired by IBM, and I want to know what the hell was going on in thousands in terms of cybersecurity at the time.
So late in these early 2000s, there were kind of 3 companies in the United States that were the centers for kind of security research at least from a commercial standpoint.
Okay.
So if you were in the Southeast, you were probably doing something with the X-Force and ISS. If you're in the Northeast, it was probably at Stake. And if you were on the West Coast, it was like Stone. So these all
Okay.
subsequently got rolled into a McAfee or a Symantec, or in this case, it get rolled into kind of that. But these were kind of the areas where like the hackers turned corporate had decided to go. Like if you weren't going into government, you were probably coming out of one of these spaces. And a buddy of mine had done a graph at one point that talked about, it was kind of a relational directed graph. And it was all of the different startups that had spun out of some of these types of ecosystems. And from the ISS one, there was such a strong entrepreneurial culture to it that a lot of people, for lack of a better term, got infected with. And I think from ISS, we had something like 75 or 80 companies that group had spun out.
Nice.
So it was just this bizarre, really lucky thing. Like I actually got recruited into it because I ran into a girl's mom who I'd gone to school with for years, and she was a technical writer for them. And I'm like,
Oh, wow.
hey, I work for a company. It sounds like some of the stuff you're doing for hobbies is what we do as a firm. And I was like, I didn't know that's a job. You guys need an intern? Cool. And I just got really, really lucky. I still keep in touch with folks. I was the best man at one friend's wedding. A guy that I shared an office with, I still talk to on a regular basis. It's just this weird small world of folks. I was texting with a guy that I used to work with there, like last night. 25 years later, we're all still very much connected.
Very cool. So I want to, okay, this is really interesting. So like my upbringing, I was like in, I guess, my early 20s or so, around San Francisco Bay Area, and we're talking, startup land, Silicon Valley, it's startup land, right? I want to know what the startup culture at, internet security system was like, where it was like spinning up these companies. So this is right around the .com, I guess, crash at the time, even too, right?
At the end of the .com boom, right into the bust. And I was there for about a year. And I was devastated getting laid off because myself and a quarter of the company got laid off in a single day. And it's like, guys, I'm making $10 an hour. You can't find the money. But they were like all interns, consultants, contractors. Like they were cutting everything possible to keep everybody that they could. But it was right at the end. But I was there for part of that boom, where it was still the good times going. Every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night, people were going out. A ton of socializing. There were a ton of like company events. They had this thing that was the purple shoe, where people like they'd get the equivalent of like a president's award, but they'd start pouring booze into this like purple shoe, and people would
of course
drink out of it. Like,
yeah.
just silly stuff. But it was, the height of the .com. Just nonsense going on. People jumping in the lake in front of the office, that kind of stuff.
How many people were at the company at this time?
100. It was probably more like 1,000 or 2,000.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it was pretty big. It was one of the first like public companies in the cyberspace.
Wow. It was a public company as well. So they were.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And there were a lot of people that made a lot of money who'd never had it. So as a result, you had some folks in their 20s and 30s, a lot of booze, some drugs, some stuff like that. But just like crazy nonsense. It's not the kind of stuff for a podcast unless you want to make it a more sensational show. Like,
I mean, it's all welcome here. As much as you want to talk about.
No, it just
is it as wild as Wolf of Wall Street, or we're talking like maybe a bit milder, or like it's probably on par?
A bit milder than that, but in that genre, like Wolf of Wall Street is up to 1,000. This was like a 20%.
Okay, all right.
But for being 15, that was also a very unique experience.
Yeah, so I guess I have a lot of different types of questions. So was this company like mature as a business, as a company, to be able to be on like public IPO offerings, or was IPO offerings were easy enough? Okay.
A little bit of both, right? There was some frothiness out there, but they started in '93 or '94.
Oh, okay.
Um,
All right. So
and,
they've been around the block.
yeah, so they started with something called Internet Scanner. At the time, you could just come up with pretty generic names because nothing else was
Sure.
taken yet. So Internet Scanner was one of the very first vulnerability scanners. So it was primarily targeted at like your public exposure, and then they expanded to the internal side. But what they ended up developing after that was one of the first network IDSs, so intrusion detection system. So this was called Real Secure. And Real Secure, again, one of these generic names, you're like, are we really secure? Sure. This was the first IDS, and then they bought Black Ice, where they ended up evolving to the first IPS.
Okay.
So these guys were really, really early. This was some of the emergent technology at end of the 90s, early 2000s. That kind of set us up for then into post 9/11 recession, and then coming out of that, you kind of get into the application security side of stuff becoming a phase. So one of the companies that had spun out of internet security systems that I ended up going to work for was called Spy Dynamics. It's spelled SPI Dynamics.
Yes. Yeah.
And I forget what the SPI was, but it was some kind of an acronym for something like secure, protect, and something else. And no one knew what it was actually meant. They just all called it SpiderDocs. And years later, they were just like, we should have just called the company Web Inspect because that's what we were known for, which was the flagship product.
Okay.
But that was some former ISS folks who had left ISS and decided, hey, we're going to go try and build this thing because the ISS guys didn't think application security was going to be a market.
Oh,
They
interesting. Okay.
were absolutely wrong about that. They were like,
Yeah.
no, people are going to care about like buffer overflows. We got the SQL injection stuff that's like wild, man. We're taking over all sorts
Yeah.
of things with it. And they're like, no, it's just a fad. The browser won't be that important, and yet now it's the ubiquitous UI for everything.
Yeah.
Um,
Interesting. They thought networks were going to be the primary foundation for
yeah,
cybersecurity at the time. Okay.
I mean, there's like an old saying, like, how do you get somebody to believe something when not believing it is like their like kind of livelihood, right? They're so dug in on we've got to be looking for network traffic. Then why would you think about a different market unless you were forced to pivot?
Right.
And at that time, it was it just wasn't necessarily a thing that you had the Google or the current kind of tech philosophy where they're going to expand the product lines. It was kind of do one thing, have a perpetual license, you sell it in, you get your support contract. Like it was a bit of a different era.
Yeah. No, completely different era. I mean, like, I guess they were like, for their defense, it's like there is no current market for it. You'd have to build up the current market, right? Is that more accurate to say?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a market for those products. Like Cisco
Uh-huh.
bought SourceFire because they became the market leader for intrusion prevention. So there's definitely a market there. But they've shifted to subscription businesses. The sales process is a bit different. People have just a different relationship with those vendors. And there's a lot more people going after the same size pie. And what I mean by that is I think 3 or 4 years ago, we crossed kind of a symbolic number of 1,337 cybersecurity startups, right? The elite
Yeah. All
number
right.
of startups. Like 2 years ago, we hit 5,000. The
Okay.
market for the
Wow.
number of buyers didn't grow 5x.
No, I
So
see.
there's that many more startups going after the same pool of capital, and their budgets didn't expand at the same rate. So there's definitely an argument that we're in kind of a frothy area, but people keep coming up with new stuff, and we've got more AI cybersecurity startups than I think we have people using AI.
We have too much AI, period, in terms of companies building ChatGPT wrappers around stuff, and like, that's a whole other conversation. I'm happy to dive in that too, but
No,
I
no,
still want to grow up the your positions and stuff like that, and understand,
yeah.
how you grew, because after SPI, you started your own company. Is it True State? Is that correct?
Yeah, So I was like, okay, I guess I'm going to do this startup thing too. Excitement, it's terrifying. So True State was this idea that a buddy of mine who had worked at Citi had.
You must have been
And
like 18, 19 at the time as well, right?
when I was studying, I was 20.
20.
Uh, which when I told people like my 25th birthday's coming up, they're like, "You've been drinking with us at the bars for years."
Yeah.
Yeah, let's not worry about that. Yeah, so True State was this idea, and this was like six, right? So the iPhone hadn't come out yet, and we thought part of the problem was that the RSA security tokens, which had a 30 or 60 second number, it comes up. We thought, for multi-factor, people don't want to have that, right? They don't want to carry around this extra token, and they don't like typing it in. What if we gave them something else that was like a USB key that looked more like a YubiKey, but not with the same kind of crypto primitives? But what if we did like mutual cert authentication with a browser on the USB key? The read-only thing. And that was interesting. That was the original idea. And then we realized that none of us knew how to build hardware. None of us spoke Chinese, so we couldn't source the hardware. And there wasn't as much of a market as we thought that there would be because we weren't solving the crux of that problem. So we pivoted into some other things of what would look like an early version of like G Suite with like browser-based Word and Excel and things like that. Like, how do you make a productivity suite? But I say the iPhone hadn't come out yet because a year later, Duo Security would start, and those guys eventually found their footing and became tremendously successful. Big fan of John and Doug over there. But what they really captured was what we didn't recognize, which was they weren't trying to get a better dongle on their keychain. They didn't want anything on the keychain to begin with because they're going to start carrying around this phone. And we're like, we didn't realize the BlackBerry iPhone phenomenon, that was the better form factor that people wanted. So they built it as an app and they came up with push notification. That when we were like, can we build you a faster horse when people actually wanted like a Model T? So
Very interesting.
Yeah, like that is all to say that that was a fascinating experience, and we ran out of money from our investors in September of 2008, and that was not a good time to go looking for money.
No, not at that time. No.
No, that was the height of the great financial crisis, which was another learning experience unto itself.
So, well, I mean, it was better to have like, ended it at 2008 than like try to start it up at 2008. I guess even hindsight on that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was the wrong product for that market. And I think it did teach me a lot about product market fit and trying to find the right thing for not just solving the problem, but solving it in the right way. And I think that's true of the security industry in general. In fact, a lot of times when I'll talk to folks and they say, well, what's the hardest problem from a security standpoint? And it's never the technical side. I should say it's almost never the technical side. It's almost always culture and how that solution is going to fit into that org. Because most of these things, we have a solution. It's not always the right solution, though. And that's where it becomes the thing about not just product market fit as a broader category, but can you find product market fit for existing options within your own company? Because it's a similar problem set. You're right. You're trying to figure out how they do things. Will this fit into their current process? And does it actually solve their problem or does it introduce additional work? Because a lot of cybersecurity products introduce additional work.
Right.
They might give you lots of new capabilities, but you already had a bunch of capabilities that you weren't using because you didn't have time for it or the expertise or another litany of things. But just saying, oh, you get this more out of it doesn't always mean you're getting more as much as you're getting more work to do. And a lot of cybersecurity is putting more work on other people's plate. So you have this other problem that you're just transferring more stuff to your SREs or the DevOps or your IT team or the other people that have to do that work.
I have a great question for you as we're having this conversation because I know you've been a CISO at multiple companies. So I'm gonna we're going to go through the process of learning more about how you got there. But as a CISO, as you're looking at different types of vendors, right? What are some of the types of solutions and products that you're like, yes, this could potentially work? And like the questions and things that you think about when bringing on a vendor such that, because one of the things you mentioned was like, you don't want to overload your existing team with more work with a new product if it means that it's going to slow down other production in other areas. So what are some of the qualifying factors for either taking in a pilot or even thinking that you want to work with a vendor?
So I've had some skepticism from folks when I'll come into a place, and a lot of times I'll joke about like, all right, let's go ask for some money and to do some stuff. We've got more projects that we keep wanting to take on. And I'll jokingly say that and then not ask for any money. Or I'll ask for a very small amount compared to my peers. And a lot of that is most of the time, if we really need a lot of money, it's a bigger project and that should take you a lot of time to figure out. If you've only been with a firm a month or two, you probably don't understand what their problem sets are. A small amount of money gets you a long way from a technical perspective. And those products are going to be what I'll call kind of keep it simple, stupid type of stuff. For instance, like canaries from Thinkist. They're, a starter pack is $5,000. You drop a couple on the network. You get low noise, high fidelity. If somebody's poking around doing a lot of reconnaissance, we're going to figure it out. And that's great. And that's the kind of thing that is not a lot of money. Like I'll drop $50,000 and put canaries in a bunch of places just within the first couple months. Cause you know what? I need to buy myself some breathing if we're not doing multi-factor. Something like Duo or a common competitor. That's a thing that you get in there for some meat and potatoes. It's going to drop 85% of authentication related issues. You can't secure what you don't know is not there. So then you look at some asset management options. On the IoT OT world, I would say Phosphorus is a great option. But that's talking my own book. I would also take a look at things like Run Zero, right? A lot of these places do a great job at having scanning capabilities to give you that initial, what is my inventory? Because you can start to build from there. A lot of security at times is just being able to answer simple questions. What assets do I have? What communication is happening between them? Are those things supposed to be communicated? Right?
Yeah, right.
Those are hard things to answer because that's a lot of data. You're getting it from different sources. What places do you have choke points or capabilities that you can pull that data from? What's the veracity of it? You don't have to have a giant budget to be able to make this stuff work. If you've got web properties, you know what? Burp Suite Pro is $500 for a single license. That's a good starting place. If you don't have that for some scanning, you don't need to spend $50,000 on, advanced tech and Theranos and all that. Go get the low-hanging fruit. There's a lot you can do for free. CodeQL does an amazing job from a static analysis standpoint. It's a great tool.
So you mentioned a few. I want to ask two questions. Just one so I don't forget was the if somebody works at a company and they're trying to get their products or sell their product or services to specific types of companies and speak to CISOs like you, what are some ways that they can help work that communication? That's the first thing. But the second question, because I don't want to forget this one either, is that at what point in a firm is it beneficial to have like a red team or some team to start testing the existing features and stuff like that to then work with blue teams to like try to figure out like what are the new services?
So I want to get into the red team, blue team stuff in just a minute, and I'll answer the first question though, because I think it's more sales, marketing type stuff, which is getting in front of folks is really difficult. I don't have the hustle that a lot of really great salespeople do. Like if someone doesn't want to talk to me, I'm not going to keep emailing. Right?
Right.
Like I'm arrogant enough to believe that what I have to say is a thing that you should want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to chase you down for the privilege.
Yeah, fair enough.
That is not the right kind of mindset that you need to be really great at sales and marketing. Breaking through though has never been tougher. In my previous roles, I got to the point that if you were not inside of the company, there's a good chance I will never see your email, much less read the first word of it. It's going into an inbox that I will never read. It's like a secondary spam filter of sorts. That was only because, again, you went from 1,000 companies to 5,000, and everybody thinks they've got a thing that's important to you.
Right.
Oftentimes, I'm going out to search them out if I'm looking for something specific, but more oftentimes than not, you're going to get it via word of mouth, via your peers, or you're going to hear about it from, we were successful with this, and we did a case study that we talked about at an ISAC or something of that nature. It's never been harder to get in cold with folks. And when you do come in through some of these like third party, and not sales consultancies, but like you're kind of paying for access. Sometimes those can be really successful. But other times you can also end up paying a lot of money to get in the door to talk to folks that aren't really in a position to buy something. So it's very dependent, but
Right.
like, you've got folks that will struggle for years. And then you've got, Wiz that'll come in 18 months is, $1 billion. I don't know the magic that makes all that work, but most of the time when you've got rapid growth, you're kind of playing some inside baseball. Your founders know a lot of the buyers, your investors know a lot of them. People are willing to pay for stuff before it's not even fully baked. Like design partner would be an aggressive term for the customer when they're also paying for stuff that's not there yet. So that
Right.
there's a little bit of magic to making that stuff work. But for folks that that figure it out, they're more luck to them.
Okay.
All right. So
Okay.
the second part about that, which is when is it right to go after a red team?
Yes.
I am of the opinion that uh, we lack any actual meaningful metrics that say, are we good at security? So I got this question when I was at Point72, which for your listeners, this is one of the larger hedge funds. So Steve Cohen, the principal there, also happens to own the Mets, and there's a lot of excitement that was going on when I happened to be there.
You mentioned he had like $1 million, $1 billion art collection that he would show off.
His art collection, I believe, is well north of $1 billion. Like he had a chrome human-sized Popeye the Sailor Man that was outside of his office in Hudson Yard, which was a Coons piece, which I think was quoted as being $65 million. And you could touch it. I wouldn't recommend it. You're not supposed to. But like, it's not like it was in a glass enclosure. We just had these incredible art collection pieces that were throughout our offices there and in Stanford. There's $250 million plus on display at like any given time, but a really incredible office space to be able to have worked in. But one of the questions that I got was, are we good at security? Now that's kind of a loaded question, because it means that you're looking for some kind of objective metric. In the hedge fund space, we talk about this concept of alpha. And alpha is you've got a benchmark, let's say it's the S&P 500, and you're trying to outperform that. How much more money did you make? And that's your alpha, right?
Right.
It's
Okay.
the did we make money?
It's the absolute. Yeah.
Yeah. And like whether that's tied to the benchmark or did we just make money versus lose money? They've got things like Sharpe ratios that talk about risk adjusted returns and all that. But at the end of the day, you can just think of alpha as like, are we making money? And if so, how much? And for someone that's used to being able to have a really objective metric, asking me, are we good at security? Well, you're not going to get a good metric from that because it's a really complicated statement. And I started to think about it. It's like, why is that when we have all of these different frameworks, right? You've got NIST, where we've got CSF and ISO, and we've got all these different frameworks from the DoD. None of them say if we're good enough. They tell you, are you mature? Is your process repeatable? It tells you, did we install the right controls places? Maybe there's some configuration. Maybe there's even specific products that we're supposed to put in place. But none of them tell us if any of those things are effective. And none of them tell us if we're good at operating. They just tell us, are we mature or getting better based on best practices? So when I think about red team versus blue team, I think about it more in kind of an existential way, and that your defensive efforts are always supposed to be driven from what the offensive capabilities that you're trying to defend are. So I don't have to necessarily do a red team to know what that's probably going to be for 90%. Like if I come in and you don't have some of the basics, I don't need somebody to tell me what that's going to be. But sometimes you need the red team or just a pen test where you've got a third party report that says, here's our problems. And you can back end that into what our project should be. You
Yes.
got in and we're able to Kerberos this and crack passwords in under a week. Maybe we have a credentialing problem. And that's when you start being able to also get creative. Like, do we have a problem with weak passwords? Yeah. Well, how about we require everybody to have stronger passwords? Okay. But those kinds of changes are things that you're going to pitch to management, and they're going to tell you to go pound sand because they can barely tell. And that is not to say that those people are not brilliant, but they're sitting there with like individual fingers on a keyboard like it's a typewriter. These are very smart people. They wouldn't be in the positions that they're in if they weren't, but they come from a different background than what you're expecting. So telling them that you want 15 or 25 character passwords instead of 8, you know what? 8 was already pissing them off. So
Okay. Yeah.
so what do you do to fix that? And it's kind of back to that product market fit issue, which is I'm not trying to make longer, complex passwords. I'm trying to have more secure credentials. And what do my users want? Well, they don't want any of that. They just want it to work. So the solution then isn't can we fix passwords? It's can we get rid of passwords in favor of something else? So can we look at, Minority Report style sitting in front of a computer and it just unlocks? Like if we could get that to work, would that be the thing? If we could make that a better option on the back end? And that's the kind of stuff where like you can make a lot of meaningful change, but really have your users as part of the impacted party because they're like, cool, that's great. I don't know what my password is anymore. They're like, you shouldn't because you're terrible at this. You shouldn't use passwords because you suck at typing them in. So let's make you better by getting rid of them because that's probably the better technical option, but there's kind of this product market and the user experience side to it. But again, it's very much informed from that red team pen test, call it what you will, that thing where you're trying to guide where the ball is supposed to go. And you're trying to follow that. Because if you're just trying to do a list of best practices, you will run out of those things that you could possibly tackle because it's too much. You've got to focus on what your problems are. And I think the red teaming is really a function of that. But specifically, I think about that back to that core question. Are we good at security? Okay, let's do a red team one time this year. We're going to find a bunch of shit we have to fix. Next year, we need to do it twice. The following year, we should do it quarterly and then monthly. Like at a certain point, you will get a better baseline. And then you're going to look for the variation from it. And that's where you can start talking about things like continuous scanning or like continuous auditing, where you're trying to figure out when did these things change because I knew they were in a good spot before. When did someone spin up a new instance in AWS that has a different profile than the other things? Like that's where you can start looking at that baseline. But until you've got a handle on the big stuff, like, you're not really going to be able to do that. But again, I think the red teaming itself is how you're getting the question of are we good at security? Are we faster at finding things? Is our mean time to detection better? Are these different things that we're finding? And you can start thinking about qualitatively as did they get domain admin this time? Or did they not? Did we have to give them help to get to this next stage? But quantitatively, you can start looking at it from like the MITRE ATT&CK concept of, hey, were they able to get from reconnaissance to a foothold? And can they get to that to then pivot? Like, do TTPs still work in this area? And if so, did they get, 3 of them or 10 of them? And you can start to look at that and kind of focus in. But the reality is, were they able to get the crown jewels that, you actually care about? And if you can start to say no to that, Are we good at security? Well, we're never good at it, but we're getting better. And I can show you that qualitatively and quantitatively, we are getting better over time. And that takes some patience, and it also takes really communicating. Because I think one of the big problems when you talk to like a board, the board of directors are not technical people. And for the longest time, people like to inundate them with, here's, a giant number because we get attacked 8 billion times a day. No, you don't. You have a computer on the internet. It gets scanned like everything else. That kind of stuff doesn't play anymore. And you've got to be a lot more thoughtful about the way that you're talking about what the program is and where you are at it. Because oftentimes you're not starting from scratch. Some kind of foundation is there. You're trying to introduce either additional controls, but you're trying to explain kind of the yin and the yang, like this is a red team and a blue team aspect of here's what we're expecting, here's what we're using to defend, and we know some of it's going to fail. So we're going to apply ideas around least privilege, defense in depth, that kind of stuff into it with the idea that these things downstream will fail, but something eventually is going to catch it.
Right.
And we don't have to be perfect, but as long as we've introduced enough compartmentalization, we can contain the blast radius when something goes wrong. Because it's going to. You're going to make a mistake. Somebody's going to misunderstand what you were asking for. There's going to be problems. But ideally, you've introduced enough things downstream that if everything goes to hell, you've got some kind of recourse for coming back from it. It's also one of the reasons I think that when we talk about the areas of investment, like people are thinking about preventative versus response and detection, but what people don't talk enough about is recovery. And I've been harping on this for years that I think like recovery and backup is probably the least invested in part of security. And it's probably the area in which the security teams have the least control right now.
That's super interesting. I'd like to ask a little bit more about that. Do you
Yeah.
feel like with the current ransomware attacks that, I don't want to say because of it, but as a result of these types of attacks, people are companies that become more aware, or do you still think it's just as bad as before?
So I think people are acutely aware of ransomware as a threat. It is what keeps people up at night more than anything else out there. It's been said, I think it was the Gruck had a quote that ransomware has done more for the cybersecurity industry in the last 10 years than the industry ever did for itself.
Interesting.
And there's some truth to that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're only
Yeah.
going to defend about what we're expecting, and ransomware is a pervasive threat. I think that's where companies like Halcyon have been really successful. They're able to really target that problem because trying to have a more robust preemptive response is a tough pill to swallow. And I think there's some of that is I'm not going to say cultural, but I think there's a problem with people's ideas around backups. And I saw this a lot with media and financial services, and you see this some with tech, and that they're asking themselves, what is differentiated data? What is a thing that if we lost it, we couldn't recover it? Or what is competitive to our space where we wouldn't want somebody else to have it? Or what's IP that if we've got a decade or 25 years of shows and they're on tapes, building caught fire, does anybody have a copy of those tapes? Or is that just lost forever? And that's what they think of as the important stuff. Now, if you're a sysadmin and you have to rebuild an Active Directory forest across 4 continents, sure, it's nice to have a copy of the directory, but you just wish the forest was up and functioning. That's technically challenging to get that to just work, to have the infrastructure there to even consume the data that was in that directory. Depending on who you talk to, though, they just assume the compute's always going to be there. They assume the infrastructure from day one is always there. If you don't have DNS, what's the first thing you need to stand up? If you don't have Active Directory, what's the thing that you need to stand up before Active Directory? A lot of people don't go through that process of what is tier 0 and then tier 1 and tier 2 and 3. And what's that differentiated data? Well, that's probably in tier 2 or 3. the rest of your environment is probably not coming back if you only had that data. And what most people are not backing up is the rest of them. They might back up some pockets of production, but then you find out that your build environment has to have a QA environment to publish into the production environment. If you've not gone through that and built the muscle memory that requires, like you don't have that solution. And as much as we think of S3 buckets in the cloud and Google Drive, you get X hundreds of gigs of storage for free. Storage is really expensive. It's still really expensive. So if I've got a company with, thousands of servers and they're 150 gig a pop and I need a month of backups, all of a sudden, not my differentiated data, just getting the instance back up and running, that starts getting expensive. And that starts becoming a hassle because who manages backups? Not the security team. It's somebody else. And that's a new project you're putting on their plate when they're already trying to do things for the rest of the business that don't care about backups. They assume you're a utility. It'll always be there. It should just work, right? Like if your order from Seamless comes in and it's wrong, you're like, you're going to start flipping tables and what? Like you become so complacent to, yeah, this is just the thing that always works. When my Uber driver shows up, I get from point A to point B. Like, what do you mean there's traffic or they took a wrong turn? Like, the idea behind the backups is it's always just supposed to be there. And most of the time it's not. And I think people outside of the IT world have this assumption that we've got things buttoned up a lot better than we do. So if you're spending a lot on backups, you're probably upset about the cost, but you're also backing up everything that you probably need. I mean, or not, and you're just cheap.
That's very interesting. So, on top of that, like, what are other things that you feel like maybe the board of other companies or even C-suite they don't know or that they should be more aware of?
Well, I think what was called Norm Macdonald joke, that, like chairman of the board should be spelled BORED. No, but now the board in many cases doesn't have a whole lot of things that they do other than be able to allocate additional money. That is not to misrepresent what a board is there for. A lot of people think a board is there for governance, and legally it is. Most of the time, the board is there for their connections and the gravitas that they bring, right? For like Theranos, why did they need military generals and Al Gore and people like that on that board? Because they get them in, you can get executives into the right rooms. You can have conversations that you couldn't have just because you've raised money. It's because you are bringing in a celebrity aspect to it, but with a seriousness. So a lot of times boards are not really there just for kind of risk management or the governance aspect. It is what they bring to the company. And in, a 10K or something like that, they're not going to say it's because this person is uber wealthy and on the board of this other thing, or we're trying to orchestrate a takeover. Like it's there, and it's oftentimes at the not just the behest of the shareholders, but really about the CEO and what they're trying to accomplish. So they want a board that's got a makeup of the things that they're not as good at, and they don't want to be managed by the board, which the board portrayed in movies would not make you think. It is more the CEO is trying to manage their board for their purpose. Because there is a resource for them, or at least that is one way of thinking about it. Some prominent investors, if they're launching takeovers or they're activists, will change the dynamic. But most of the time, if you've got a strong CEO, they are managing the board, not the other way around. So what can the board do? Well, most of the time, if you've got a CISO, you want the CISO to present to the board, but you don't want that CISO to be in conflict with what the CEO is saying. So the worst case scenario for the CEO is for the CISO to get in there and say, hey, we've got all these problems the CEO didn't want to talk about, and I need more money. Well, the CEO should have said, hey, this team needs more money, and here's why we're going to give it to them. So a lot of this falls into the what is the company trying to achieve, and are they willing to make those investments? Is that the right thing for the company? In some cases, like, make do with what you got and figure it out And if you don't get it done, you don't get it done. And we're going to walk a tightrope there between cutting costs or growing revenue because they're trying to get to a next thing. Where that liability falls and who's responsible if they're not doing everything that they could or should. I don't think teams out there are going to do everything that they could or should. That's just not practical. But there's some art to that because it's not a science and every place is going to be different. The board's going to need to know when there's an incident. The board's going to need to know kind of the direction that you're taking, but they don't really understand it. And that's not a fault of theirs. And it kind of goes down this rabbit hole question of should you have security expertise on the board? And given many of these board spots are well compensated, I think that's a great idea if I'm the person you're putting on that board, because I would love those positions. But in general, I don't think that's a good thing because, again, it's not about risk management and it's not about governance. Those are helpful to have, but anybody can do that. If you're on that board because of a specialty and you've got a unique view, I think different views and different backgrounds are great too. They will introduce different conversations, different concerns. It's a diversity of thought, not just of gender or race or other backgrounds. But just because you're good at security doesn't mean that the company is going to be more secure. And I think it probably means you're going to second guess and you're going to cycle through them more often.
Interesting, yeah.
You either get a leader that you trust and believe, or if you're not sure if you do, you can get outside help to evaluate them. But you put people in charge and then you trust them.
Right.
Because otherwise they just shouldn't be in charge. Like you don't need a secondary CISO to watch the other CISO. That's going to produce bad outcome. Your CISO should be working hand in hand with the CEO and the board, and they should be on the same page. Which is why, I don't think security is a thing you need on the board as much as whoever runs security should have the trust of the board, and they should be a person that can speak in plain language and explain what's going on, and not try to inundate them with, the baffle them with bullshit concept where you throw so much data at them that they're just like, yeah, we're not smart enough to comprehend this. Just give them whatever they want. Because that also creates kind of a bad dynamic too, which is if they don't understand it, you may have a really good plan and they should fund it 100%. But if they're like, we don't really get it, we know they're doing good work, but let's just give them 60% of whatever they ask for, and that's probably good enough. That doesn't get you everything when you really need it. And it also doesn't mean that they have the trust that you're going to be able to execute properly. So there's just this thing where the board is there for a reason, and it's not the reason that you hoped it was there for. They can change the dynamic, but you better not go in there and be on a different page than what the CEO is trying to accomplish. Because that's a good way to end up as the former CISO and not the current one.
Yeah, that definitely sounds like that would be a bit of a problem. I would like to know more about Drawbridge Networks, because you were the founder of that, right? And then it was later acquired by OPEC?
Yeah, so I was co-founder of Drawbridge with my co-founder, Tom Cross, who is super brilliant. Can't say anything but great things about Tom. So Tom and I had been talking for years at that point. And
where did you guys meet, and then when did the idea come to fruition?
I met Tom when I was working at Spy Dynamics, and he and I were connected through our good friend Billy Hoffman, who I worked with at Spy, and they had known each other through the local Southeast 2600 world. So that same group that I started going to, Tom and I had run into each other before, but Billy had a dinner and sat us next to each other. An hour into the dinner, I remember what we came up with, but it was neither appropriate or constructive to discuss. Okay. But Billy was just like, you two are some of the smartest people I know. That's what you came up with? And I'm like, what are you going to do? So I was talking to Tom, and this was 2013, about software-defined networking. Now, this was at the time that software-defined everything, data center, industry, there's going to be an API for everything, and it's going to change the world. And I was like, the software-defined networking space is so interesting. There's all this neat stuff happening. But what would that look like to do for an entire enterprise? And could we start segmenting from a point-to-point concept, such that, desktops, when you logged in, you'd only get access to the few things that you actually need and nothing else? And we started talking through these ideas of like some overlay networks and how that would work for the protocols and open flow and all that. And what we came up with, and there was not a term for it at the time, it would eventually be called network micro-segmentation.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
we
Okay.
at the time we were kind of punting on it and calling it like, well, it's this, and like zero trust wasn't a term yet either. So we're like, it's like centrally orchestrated software-defined networking, but it's implemented with like host-based firewalls. So maybe as we're like catching connections on the incoming and outcoming, we'll broker that out. And that's actually what led to the term like Drawbridge Networks, is we were catching connections on both sides. So you could think of it like both sides of a drawbridge would come down. And if you had one side that was compromised, but the other didn't want to permit it, it would still protect it because you had both sides.
Okay.
So that was kind of the idea. And we got the tech to work. It was really, really great technology. This was less of a product market, more a timing issue. 2 weeks before we got acquired by Opaque, Gartner put out their first like actual note on microsegmentation, in which they talked about us. And we got more inbound demand in the last 2 weeks that we were an independent company than we had for the entire lifespan of the company. I think we arguably had some of the best technology out there. We definitely had the cleanest kind of story from an implementation and design and all that. But we had only raised about $3.5 million. And it was an uphill battle in which everybody else was, $50 to $150 million raised. They had some better traction. The story was starting to develop. And I think had we stuck around, we probably would have been a pretty influential player. But you just can't predict the timing in these things. But we built some really, really incredible tech that kind of laid the foundation of what Opaque Networks had become. And again, timing is everything. They had incredible investors. They had raised a bunch. We're just getting a ton of traction in the market. And then they decided that, hey, it's a pandemic and we'll never raise money again. The capital markets are going to go away. And Fortinet swooped in and picked them up.
Nice. Beautiful. And then how did you guys, this probably goes back to the beginning. So while you guys were developing the tech, how did you guys figure out who would be the best customers for this these specific products? And like, did you guys do a pilot, or like, how did you guys get the first sales and stuff like that?
So for Drawbridge, a lot of that was commonized network of just existing peers calling people, being like, "Hey, this is what we're building." But when we start talking to those people, they're excited about it. They've got cycles, and then 6 months later, we're like, "Hey, I've got stuff to finally roll out." And they're like, "Yeah, our priorities changed. Things have shifted. We've now got, or we're leaving this company to go to another." So it's a constant moving target. But the thing that we were trying to address had a lot of repercussions that were tied to Chinese APT.
Okay.
So when we started, a lot of the learned experience that we were going off of was what was happening like 2013, 2014, in which case you would have an APT break in, they'd get an initial foothold, and then they'd start to live off the land and pivot. And most of our networks in the enterprise world are effectively flat. So we're like, all right,
got it.
So what do we do to segment that and not have a firewall on every single switch? Because that's just not practical from a cost perspective. And then, like, what do you do to manage policy? Because you've got the firemons and the algosecs and stuff like that we're trying to make it easier to build policy in the traditional way. So, like, could we do this new thing? And like SDN seemed like a rethinking of that kind of paradigm. But 2014 going into 2015, that APT behavior fell off a bit. So the pressure wasn't there as much. And what we, in retrospect, had learned was that the Obama administration had made a deal with the Chinese that they were like, hey, stop breaking into American companies and trying to do forced technology transfer. And I guess that negotiation worked a little bit. And they were like, okay, we'll stop paying our contractors to do that. I'm assuming that that's roughly what the conversation was. I don't think they actually said that. But they were like, yeah, sure. So they stopped paying them. And within about 3 months, what started to happen was we saw a massive uptick in ransomware. Because when the state stops paying you to be really good hackers, and all you can do to make money is be really good hackers, how are you going to leverage that to make money? So now the state doesn't want it for forced technology transfer. They're just going to let you take over whatever you want and use ransomware as a way to monetize that. So all of a sudden, where we thought they were going after U.S. industry, they start going after hospitals and local governments and all these things that weren't important from an espionage standpoint. They become very soft targets, though, from a ransomware standpoint.
That's interesting.
So there was this odd dynamic where, like, we thought we were trying to stop nation state attackers, and then because I started getting calls from friends who are like, hey, we're used to worrying about that problem when it's think tanks and when it's the US government and defense contractors. So we were kind of building for the tip of the spear, and then all of a sudden that tip of the spear turned into, yeah, this is happening everywhere. And we just thought it was like we were assuming criminal elements, and all of a sudden you've got state actors that are doing it. So it was just kind of an odd shift at that time. But you can kind of point to a confluence of the Obama administration and the relationship with presumably Chinese state-connected orgs, rise in ransomware, but also a rise in the use of cryptocurrency. The biggest pushback for the longest time on cryptocurrencies was, it's only for crime and money laundering and all that. And you're like, I mean, it was. It's true. That was a thing. It was used for a lot. And the rise in value made it possible to be able to ransomware a hospital for $25 million. And, we're not going to Western Union for that. So the ability to have Bitcoin and make payments. So I think that is partly, from a timing standpoint, really drove that spike. There's no coming back from that.
Exactly, and that's where our company, Top Cleared Recruiting, comes in. Finding the right cybersecurity talent with the necessary clearances can be a major hurdle. Did you know that it could take 8 to 15 months on average to hire somebody with a TS SEI plus full polyscope? At Top Cleared Recruiting, we have a network of 1.3 million cleared professionals, ranging from C&O developers, reverse engineers, and data scientists. Whether you're working on offensive operations or data analysis, we connect you with the elite talent you need fast. Visit topclearrecruiting.com and let us help you to find the perfect candidate, already cleared and ready to go. Interesting. Okay, I'd like to. I do want to expand and talk about Phosphorus in a little bit and how you guys help for those types of solutions. But before we get into that, you were the CISO at Fox News, so I would love to hear what it's like to defend and protect networks from such a large news publication and media site, and the types of attacks that were potentially going on that you had to worry about. Because I'm sure it's different than if it was other types of industries and sectors, right?
Yeah. So I joke I was the first and last CISO during the first Trump administration for Fox News. I say first and last because they had not had someone in that role formally before.
Really? Wow.
So it was kind of a unique thing. So Fox News was one of, call it 12 subsidiaries of 21st Century Fox, the parent company, which was also part of News Corp at one point. So News Corp and 21st Century Fox separated, and News Corp, which has the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, stuff like that became a separate entity. And then 21st Century Fox was all of the media assets. So that included the film studio, Fox Broadcasting, which is the TV station, Fox Sport, Fox News, a bunch of the independent owned kind of local TV stations like a Fox 5. But the film studio and the TV production were massive. Tens of thousands of employees, including a lot in LA, its own city. I mean, it literally has its own police and fire department. It's massive. So this is all to say that the parent company, 21st Century Fox, had a CISO. and they would sometimes like intervene with the different kind of child entities. Fox News was unique, and it was kind of hands off thing, where until Roger Ailes passed away, which that predated me by about 18 months. He had left and passed away, and there was this power vacuum. And then all of a sudden, the parent company was able to intervene more just because they didn't have as much of the strong personalities. And like with Fox News, like the Murdochs were directly involved at times. So like it was its own special carve out. So when I started my second week there, they had announced that 21st Century Fox was going to sell the bulk of their assets to Disney. So that's why I joke that I was the first and last, because I left the day after the Disney deal closed. So for about a year and a half, it went from my first week was, hey, let's build out the security program for the Fox News side to build on top of what was there. And my second week was, well, that's completely different. This is going to be a totally new company. A couple of the child entities remain, and that is what is now Fox Corp, where they built more kind of a shared services offering, because it was just going to be a smaller entity. So do you need divisional execs for each one? Or can you unite HR and legal and IT, including security, and put that across the entire org? So that's where that kind of shift came in. But to your original question, protecting the media entity, it's different because it's a different way to think about what your threats are.
Right.
So when I would think about Fox News, and this is true of any company that you're trying to figure out the mechanics of, the first thing you do is ask, how do I break the business? More specifically, how do I impact revenue? And on the Fox side, they've got kind of a unique setup, and not that unique from a legacy media bundled channels. But because Fox Broadcasting, Fox News, and Fox Sports were all kind of sold to the cable providers at one time as a singular thing, you didn't really get the option to opt out. So if you wanted Fox, you had to take news and sports. So you couldn't just like cherry pick them. And as a result, the revenue was really sticky. So the retransmission fees were like 93% of what their revenue was. So even when they've got independent ads that might be sold for gold coins or like whatever it is, the core of what their revenue engine was coming from, though, was this retransmission fee for cable. So they had a lot of things that were tied into what your traditional subscription like cable fee was. So now with cord cutting, that like generationally, I think the management team there has figured out we're going to have to figure out a pivot and some other option, just because that's becoming such a huge trend. But at that time, it was pretty clear, like, yeah, you can do a whole lot of stuff as long as you can broadcast, you're still getting paid. So it didn't really matter if subscribers left or not, because you're still getting paid.
Interesting. Wow.
So the core focus then is, resiliency-wise, how do you keep the institution up? So it was looking at the broadcast environments and making sure that those don't go down, because, and I see this with a lot of customers at Phosphorus, when you start talking about not traditional IT, where you're talking about this kind of XIoT bucket of embedded devices and cameras and ruggedized printers and manufacturing facilities, like all of this stuff that doesn't have traditional agents, you're looking at a lot of default passwords and old software. And
Right.
if
Definitely.
they're all the same thing, there's not a whole lot of variation where like it would stop a worm or some sort of pervasive compromise. So if you can take out one of these devices, you're probably taking out all. And that was true in kind of the media world. It's true in all of kind of IoT, OT world. And it's definitely a problem across the board. But before we get off of that, the other thing that was unique on the media side, and I saw this some at Point72 during like the meme stock stuff, and when your boss buys the Mets, when you start talking about executive protection, you're like, Chinese APT is one thing to defend against. Mets fans are a whole other kind of crazy.
Really?
But the meme coin stuff, because we had some association with the Gabe Plotkin, Melvin Capital shorting of GameStop stuff.
Yeah.
We had some of our executives publicly, like, I don't want to say targeted, but like they got some nastygram. There was nothing there that was a physical threat, but it was people that just like they saw these names in the media and built these conspiracy theories where they're just like, oh, he used to work at Point72 must be in on it. That was couldn't be further from the case. The whole meme coin saga was a confluence of a bunch of odd events that you really couldn't have predicted in that way. We didn't have a lot of exposure, but our name made it into enough things online that people start to target. The Fox side had some similarities, right? There was a closeness for certain on-air personalities to the Trump administration,
Right.
and that
Yeah.
produces a lot of weird dynamics.
I mean, you
Where
get a lot of hate from different types of people, I suspect, and then they
you
would just want to
you
attack the
you
network or even the individuals.
Yeah, I mean, we had like some old message boards and stuff that weren't really maintained well, that got like compromised from some foreign entities. There was always some kind of phishing going on, but there was a bit of a concern where is there like kind of a not contagion, but like is there some overflow risk where anything that gets near the administration might start going after some of the personality. So like that was a thing that we were concerned about. Unfortunately, knock on wood, we didn't have anything that had manifested as like a problem. But, I think there's just when you're near celebrities, when you're near government officials, like in the same way that like a think tank is close to members of Congress. They don't necessarily make the decisions, but they're close to them. So you're going to try to gather as much intelligence as possible. So I think that's a thing in general when you're just dealing with anyone that's close to any important people.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for answering that. You provided a lot of insight that would not normally have heard. So me and my audience, thank you for that.
Yeah, sure.
Now moving over towards Point72, which you were there for about 2 years, almost 3 years going. So it sounds like you've had more time to analyze when you came in different types of things. So what was it like when you showed up there? And then what were some things that you were able to bring that first year, second year, and then into the following year after?
Yes. Like having worked at BlackRock and NASDAQ prior, I had a reasonable understanding of capital markets, how prime brokerages worked, how clearing and settlement was supposed to happen. I think my time there was interesting just because I got to see a lot. And it was going through kind of a transformational time. The hedge fund industry was never really a work from home culture. And I think it was like my fourth month with them. We announced we were sending everybody home because we were in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, you started November 2019, so like what, 3 months? Like it's like, all right,
like,
everyone, we're shifting, and yeah.
So for New York City, I think we banned. I think the city started shutting down. It was the day after St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, it was like
March.
It was like immediately March hit. Everything was just, I was in San Francisco area at the time.
I think it was the 18th that it shut down. It was like because I think it was the day after St. Patrick's Day. And like it was just this kind of odd, surreal thing. I stayed in the city through the entire thing, which was its own experience. We were having block parties and drinking under tents in the park and stuff. It was just some wild nonsense. But I think it was kind of just a fascinating experience being closer to the front office than I had been traditionally. Because at BlackRock, I focused a lot on the Aladdin platform, but really getting a lot more front office exposure. Just as someone who has a passion for the capital markets, I thought that was a really interesting thing. And also having founded a company prior, having access to their venture capital group. And I found that to just be a fun and kind of exciting thing, was to be able to sit in on certain pitches and get more exposure to kind of what's coming down the pipe. Yeah. And what things are they seeing? So like one of the more interesting kind of bridge roles that people can have is you've exited a startup, you've done well. Now they're going to make you the entrepreneur in residence at some venture firm. And you get to spend, call it 12 to 18 months, just sitting in pitch meetings and figuring out if you want to be somebody's co-founder, You start seeing the trends of where the market's going, who's pitching. You get a lot of exposure to what's out there. And you also get to critique and be like, I kind of like that space, but not the idea. Here's a take we haven't heard on it. Like you get to be a subject matter expert. And while I was not that for Point72 Ventures, I think that's a really neat role. And I got some exposure to that to be able to sit in on some of those things.
Very cool.
So if any of your listeners has an opportunity to do that for a top tier like venture firm, they probably see 5,000 pitches a year. They say yes to like 10 or 20 of them. The other 4,900 and some odd, you're going to see a lot of neat information that you wouldn't have otherwise, that may never see the light of day. And it will definitely guide you in what you want to do next.
Super interesting. So what are some, let's say, we have some of our listeners, they just had their exit and they're looking to potentially do this. Obviously, if the funds come to them and say, hey, we want you, that's easy. But let's assume like that doesn't happen. What type of communication and networking do you think would it take to be able to get something like that set up?
So you definitely want to keep a warm relationship with anybody who's invested in a company that you've been in prior. But keep in mind that like VCs are connectors of people in many cases. They're not just capital. So they can connect you to prospects and partners and potential hires. If they're just a check, they're probably not, the best firm. They might be fantastic people, but there's not a lot more that they bring with it necessarily. Like that said, I think more in-person networking is coming back. That was not a case for years, just with the pandemic. I think the more and more as that starts to come back, you're going to see more exposure to additional funds. But the reason that they are connectors in this way is not just out of the goodness of their heart. They're oftentimes very wonderful, gregarious people. They're super generous. But this is also because they want to invest in the next hot thing. And they think that you might be an exciting person. They want you to sit in those meetings, not because they want you to come up with a great idea. They do. They want you to sit in there and come up with a great idea that they can invest in before anybody else. And then they want to talk that investment up to every person they've ever met so that when the next person comes along, they want to lead the next investment so that on paper, they're now worth that much more. It's not nefarious. It is self-serving in that capacity, but that's a good thing. That's how people go, you know what? I'm going to be the first money in. And when the 10th person comes in, then my investment is worth that much more. And we want to invest in you because we think, you're special and you're not going to go to our top 10 competitors and shop the deal around. We'll wait until you've built some additional value and then let them be the next check-in.
Beautiful. And then, so on top of being able to see like those types of meetings, what are additional things? Or like more on the security side of things, like what were some things that you had to shift over from coming from like Fox News and other types of things? I mean, you said you already had the consulting experience at both NASDAQ as well as BlackRock. So going into this, did you feel completely prepared, or did you feel like, oh, there's some things here I didn't really expect, or what was the feel going in on the technical side, and then everything else that you had to do is around that time?
So these days, it's never a surprise on the technical side. I'm kind of seeing everything that I'm going to see. Oftentimes, the biggest surprise is never going to be technical. It's always going to be cultural. It's going to be about understanding what things work for the people. Again, there are not a lot of technical challenges out there. There are solutions that aren't the right thing for the right organization. A great example is the one I brought up before. They didn't want linear passwords. They just didn't want passwords. And figuring that out and teasing that and pulling on that string was less about trying to say, okay, NIST recommends this. This is what we're going to do. To, okay, you guys are pushing back on this. Why? And starting to observe how they thought about computers and what their problems were and how they started to think about things. A big thing that I kept pushing was, you guys can trade all of the crypto assets that you want, but we're not going to custody them for you. We'll have a third party do that. And the reason is when they get compromised, we'll have their insurance carrier write us a check for whatever the difference is. And then I don't have to worry about somebody coming after us because you guys want exotic moon points. And that's just a transference of risk type of thing, but they wanted to trade because there was liquidity there and it was tradable. And
Right.
call it gambling or a thing that they're good at. You can call it luck or you can call it skill. But for whatever they're trying to do, you're trying to enable the front office to be able to do the thing that they're good at. So these are multi-strategy, multi-manager funds. So you can think of them as like there's a central pool of capital. And then throughout the year, they'll have different portfolio managers and teams that do better at certain things. So some of them trade these commodities, and part of the year, that's a good trade. So we'll shift all the capital over there when they've got something that they're really good at. And then part of the year, we'll have other people that are better at different things. And it's kind of capital seeking the right managers. And when the managers don't perform, you start swapping people out. So
Okay.
you can end up managing a lot of money with a lot of different approaches to things.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to understand what is the thing that enables them to be the best at what they do. That's not the thing that's surprising as much as it's the thing that's interesting. And it keeps you, it keeps you showing up the next day. Because if it's just hey, we've got a patch, I mean, that gets old. You get better at patching. But like, if that's the only thing that you've got to do, then like you're not making a meaningful step to either creating a better solution for people or improving the state of security.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in terms of improving the state of security, right? So after Point72, then you started and moved over to Phosphorus cybersecurity. So
Yeah.
we'd love to hear that transition and also more about Phosphorus and like what solutions and things like you guys are doing for your clients and customers.
So again, I said I got lucky when I started on the X-Force at ISS. And out of happenstance, the co-founder and CEO of Phosphorus was my boss's 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 boss at ISS. Because I was their 15-year-old hacker intern, and he was the director of X-Force, and my cube is outside of his office. Because nobody else wants to sit in front of the boss's office. So I got really lucky in getting to know Chris, who had founded Phosphorus. And when I was at Point72, Chris had called me up and was like, hey, we're doing this thing. And it took me a couple of weeks because I was like, yeah, man, I don't think I've got an IoT issue. And then there was a conversation that had to do with Point72 and Steve Cohen's art collection and how that factored into collateral. And I was like, well, crap, I actually have to be concerned about this. And then I realized that like they've got default passwords on all the cameras and the firmware is 6 or 7 years old. What happens, because like there's a monitoring service, but what happens if we could just pause the feed?
Yeah,
Could I just walk out the door with the $10 or $20 million piece? I was like, all right, come on in and show me what I don't know. Because for the longest time, when I thought about the IoT security problem, a lot of that came from the experience that I had seen with peers at like the New York Times in 2014. So they had a breach. I think it was 2014. It might have been 2013. But essentially, there was a breach, and they had mandated somebody else come in. They thought they eradicated it. It was some kind of state actor, right? They were going after somebody on human rights issues, and they couldn't get to them, so they were trying to get to the reporters that were reporting on it. So, all right. They think they got the Chinese actors out, and then they keep getting reinfected, and it just keeps happening. They're like, what the hell is going on? And they just couldn't figure it out. And it took them about 6 months, and they finally found it. These state actors had found a point of persistence on an IP-enabled thermostat. So IT didn't manage it. They didn't even know about it. The facilities team just plugged it in and said, we got to have a network connection. So they plugged it in.
Yeah, interesting.
And that kind of had dictated my thought process around the kind of IoT, OT world, which was, we're not trying to protect those devices. We assume that they're dumb. We assume they can be compromised. We want to protect ourselves from those devices. So firewall them off, find aggressive filtration, get really specific choke points if we have to talk to them, but don't let them talk to the rest of the IT, because that might
Yeah.
be a way that you could hang out, persist, and reinfect the network. So you fast forward to the Phosphorus guys are coming in when I'm at Point72, and they're giving me a debrief because like the product was kind of half baked at the time, and we're an early customer. I was like, I don't care about the UI, just show me what you guys found. And they sit down, and like 25 minutes later, I'm like, so it's 1995. Like, how is this possible? What year is this? It's
Yeah.
2020, and you guys are showing me stuff, that's 25 years old that should not exist. And we got your phones, we got your printers, we got your cameras, we got all the door controllers. I'm like, so you're going to come in and pause a video feed, steal stuff off the wall, and then make it so I can't call the cops to even report it. They're like, yeah, pretty much. And we got it with like default passwords and like stuff that doesn't even require like a memory corruption button. Okay.
Wow.
So help me fix this. So what the Phosphorus guys ended up building was this vulnerability scanner for the IoT OT world that also went the next step, which was, okay, I can find problems. That's the easy part. Now I'm going to help you fix them. So they would instrument how you administer all these things. And whether that's a web interface where they talk a bajillion different protocols from SIP to S7 and BACnet, like all of this stuff that no one else would use unless you were forced to by legacy industry things, that
Yeah.
is the
Right.
IoT and OT world. If it's not a web browser, it's a bunch of these obscure protocols that aren't that obscure. But they go through and talk all these things, and then they build in the ability to do things like change password, upgrade firmware, turn on and off certain features. So provided it's exposed, they can then pull that functionality into their product and serve as almost like a translation layer from your enterprise
Interesting.
PAM solution to like checking out passwords. So now they can talk the native language of all of your IoT, OT devices, or what's been kind of labeled as this cyber physical class of devices, and that they're not just a computer, they're a computer that does stuff in the physical world. But they're then kind of this bridge between all the IT investments and how do you manage devices that were never meant to be managed.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so I was excited to hear about Phosphorus, and I was like researching what you guys do because I used to work at a company called Assimile. I don't know if you've heard of this company. I was like employee number 3, 4, whatever, as a security researcher, and Assimile specifically targeting protect hospital networks from exploitation. And the way that we solve it was through network segmentation, right? So it was my job to basically take a copy of the entire NVD database, get all known CVEs, and associate those with every single device that we had. At the time, we had about 6 clients, 100,000 devices each client, or so to speak. And then I would also create the workarounds and solutions for them if they had to like keep the device on the network for whatever reason and had to do so. So it was network segmentation that we utilized. But the interesting for analyzing what devices were on the network is because of the hospital networks, we weren't able to send like SIM packets because they would like crash an insulin pump, right? So we had to do different types of passive like monitoring and stuff like this, right? So all of these things like I was learning at the time. So I would be very much interested in hearing more about like how you guys are like solving the solutions, because it sounds like because the things that I was thinking about, right, was what if we get a device, that's on this network, right? It was utilized for years and built, sold, and now no one's updating the software. Now it's completely dead in the water. The firmware is never going to be updated, right? And in some cases, in some devices, like you can't even update the password and stuff like that. So what do you do with some of these types of devices and things?
The general idea is that for those devices, for the longest time, I think we all ignored them, and we tried to treat them as these things that weren't critical to what we do. And I think that the assumption was that we'll just end of life them, and they're probably not that important anyway. And yet they're oftentimes more expensive than a regular computer, and they're critical to what we do, even though we don't realize it sometimes. So think like a ruggedized printer, right? Like a Zebra printer prints off a label for a wristband. Now, that doesn't sound that impactful, except if you're a hospital, you can't be admitted unless you have that wristband. So
Yeah.
If you can't print the thing that they put on the wristband, well, they don't let you see a doctor. And that is problematic because it's a hospital. So it's stuff like that a lot of times we just don't think of as being that important. But there are some things we can't fix. So if the device is not fixable, one of the data points that we provide you is it end of life? Is this a
Right. Yeah.
camera that they don't produce anymore or that you can't buy even if you wanted to? Like, that's a good thing to know. From an inventory standpoint, are we going to have to do a refresh of every one of these devices or class of devices for all of our offices? If so, we should plan for that. If not, like, how long can we get away with it? Are two
Yeah.
devices of 2000 about to die, or is it 1900 of 2000?
Yeah, that's a good question that I have. So, like, do you guys even catch them before end of life happens to be like, hey, like when they say like this is going to be end of life like next year? Do you say that hey, this is going to be end of life this next year? You have this many, so cost wise, it's going to be this. So you guys need to start budgeting accordingly.
Yeah, so it's vendor specific, and we can tell you, hey,
Nice,
they've
yeah.
announced this is going to go on this date, or it's
Hmm.
already gone, or there's certain things like that. We can tell you that. You've got to figure out, our
Yeah, they
policy
can do that.
is we'll cycle through it, or here's where we want to do the budget planning. But do we have the data? Absolutely.
Nice. Okay. Very cool. And then, so this is more about the company and like the ethos of like building out a team in cybersecurity. So like, what are some of the things that you look for when you're building out a team, and like, how have you or your team or the company have like handled some of these challenges?
So when you're building out a team, and I saw something on LinkedIn in the last week that had some kind of prescriptive, like based on the size of your company, here's what your team should look like. There's no right or wrong answer. The best answer is, at least this is my opinion, don't try to have regime change because oftentimes the people that are there before you will be there after you. And if they've been around for even a little while within that org, they know where some of the bodies are buried and they've figured out the dynamics of how to stick around. So I would suggest leaning into asking them, not telling them what the priorities are supposed to be. If you try to be too dictatorial and not collaborative or asking for input and you're just telling them, you're going to get people that try to subvert you. And they'll do it in passive aggressive ways. So definitely try to do that, over communicate where possible, but try to foster the people that are there because everybody wants to do a good job, right? Like
Right. Right.
there's not a single person showing up who's like, I want to do a bad job and be terrible at this. Like, no, people want to be good at their job, their excitement, enthusiasm. Those are things you can't necessarily teach, but you definitely need to foster the skill and the ability to execute. Like, that's stuff that people will figure out. But definitely never forget your number one job as manager is not getting more projects done. It's managing the people who work for you's career. And you want to manage them to the best that they can be, whether that's working for you or not. The rest you'll figure out. You need to have a good understanding of what your attack surface looks like, being able to understand what capabilities you have, what gaps exist, whether that's a separate person for application security versus cloud versus vulnerability management, or maybe that's one person because they're the right person to run all three. Like, none of that matters. Like, that is all personality specific and, tied to projects and objectives and what you're trying to do. You focus on the people, the rest will work itself out.
Got it. And then some advice I like to give and share with the audience, because a lot of them are having difficulties even finding work and stuff like that. So what are some things that you look for when you're hiring your team?
Most of the people that I've hired normally come from my network. Get out and socialize. Make sure if you've got a local event, try to go on a regular basis. If you're in the New York City area, we've got something called NISEC, which is the
Nice.
third Tuesday of every month, and you should be able to find it on Twitter.
I'll
And
link
then,
it as well.
yeah. And then the other thing that is local to New York City, you should come out for SummerCon. So this is America's oldest hacker conference. It's summercon.org. And I think that's been in July, the past couple of years. I happen to sit on the board of the foundation that runs it. But just get involved with your local community because you're going to learn more about what's going on than you ever could from a bulletin board somewhere.
Yeah. You mentioned being on the board. How did you get on the board for this conference?
So I joined the board there, I guess 6 or 7 years ago. They were going through a transformation of their finances and needed some help, and I had just exited from like Drawbridge. That timing was just kind of happened to work out.
So they sought you after, and then what have been some of the things that you've been doing there?
Well, so I started going as an attendee and had known the guys that ran it for many, many years. And
Okay.
they were just kind of burnt out and needed some help.
I would like to know more about let's talk more about your company and stuff like that. So what are some new objectives and things that are on the horizon that you guys see coming?
Sure. And I may have to switch my audio in a couple of minutes because I think I may be running out of battery.
Okay.
But I've got a backup, so if that happens,
We can take a minute if you want to take 2-3 minutes to set that up. That's fine.
yeah. Let me make sure this is charged.
Sure. Yeah, take your time.
See if I can get this to work.
Yep, we're good. Is this a different microphone?
Okay. Is this coming through?
It's coming through. The other one was better, but it'll be fine. I just want to make sure that you are connected to it. Let's see. So audio is coming through your Pixel 5. I don't know. There's a drop down. Maybe you are able to see if it's coming through your headset or not, or the actual microphone on the Pixel 5.
It should be coming through the headset.
Okay. Maybe how about we do a test? Like blow on the headset and see if the audio goes through it. Yep, that worked. Yeah, that works.
Well, then it's coming through. It's coming through the headset.
All right, cool. That sounds good. I have one question. So, like, before we get over to the Phosphorus thing, let me see. 1 second. Test. Okay. So this is a question. Like, were you at DEF CON? You go to DEF CON every now and then, I suppose?
Yeah. So my first DEF CON was 2001. I think it was DEF CON 10.
Wow. Okay. Did you go to like the one in like 2017 or around there? Do you know?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a time I was at a bar and I spoke to somebody and I think they worked at Fox News. I just gone to the DEF CON shoot and like I was telling them like how I got like shot or like a ricochet. And we had a conversation. Yeah, I didn't want to tell the organizers because like I was like hurt and I was like, well, I don't want this to be like stopping because I love the shooting. I love shooting and I think this is a great thing or whatever. But yeah, like I had like yeah. It was like a ricochet. It wasn't. I don't know whatever happened, but like I was just standing there and something like came back and I was like that feels weird. And then I look and I was like bleeding a little bit and I was like whatever. And then like the next day there was like a like sizable like hole, not hole, but like a bruise there. And I was like, oh shit, I don't know, maybe that was something. But so like all DEF CON, I'm like walking around with this. Yeah, man. Well, I don't even know if I wasn't even shooting. That's right. I was like behind the line. So somebody else was shooting, but I don't know. It was fun. I got to shoot like a 50 cal that DEF CON. I'm just so juiced about that still. It's so sick. Yeah. Right. So yeah, very cool. And I also I was living in Atlanta for a little while. I was living off Peachtree Street because I worked at Georgia Tech for a little while, and I like would go to Vortex. There's like a bar and grill right there. But when I was there, like you could still smoke in the bar. I'm like, this is like, I come from California. I'm like, this is insane to me. But I was like, this is interesting.
I think it's at least the one in Midtown. I think you can still smoke inside.
When's the last time you went? I went in like 2019 and they said no. It was all cleaned up. I was like, this is sad.
It was there 2 years ago, something like that.
Oh yeah, maybe still.
Cool.
That's fair. I was over in Texas for whatever conference or thing or something, and I went to like a TGI Fridays. I think it was TGI Fridays, and like, no one's smoking, like whatever. It's just a normal TGI Fridays. And then 9 p.m. hits, and then the waitresses are coming around dropping off the stuff, and then everyone starts lighting up. I was like, what happened? And it's like, oh, 9 p.m. we can smoke now. I'm like, thinking, I'm like, what kind of weird ass policy is this? It's like, yeah, one side of people being like, we don't want smoking, and other times like, we do, and then it's like, how about 9 p.m. and they're like, perfect.
Because Atlanta was for a long time like this, and it's still do. A lot of that came from the justification that you're trying to stop the secondhand smoke for kids and people that smoke.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
assumption is the second you become a bar at 7 or 9 or like whatever it is, those people that shouldn't be out or saying what to get into, and
Oh, okay.
change past that
9
time.
p.m.
So
Yeah.
if they switch over where they're smoking, I think there was you had to turn one up at that time, so that at least it was only adult. And not only we're going to do it because well, I grew up in Atlanta and I moved to New York and then to Texas for a bit and then was out in the Bay Area for about 4 years before New York. It's it's wild. Like they started a smoking ban in New York when I first moved up here six. And that was unheard of for me because I was coming from Atlanta that had no smoking. Um,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and like I was I don't think I've been smoked now for 8 years or nine, something like
Ah,
that.
congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, first time, but yeah, it was such a different experience going from a place where like you could smoke everywhere to now you can smoke nowhere except for outside to then having like this blend, and then
Yeah. Yeah.
a weird dynamic in like California where they're like, ah, we're clear as human trafficking, but smoking is not okay.
Yeah. You mentioned, yeah, you had mentioned you were in New York during COVID, and I was in Daly City. So you know the Bay. You've been there for 4 years. You know where Daly City is. I was in Daly City living at the time, and then COVID happened, and I was like, everything was closed, and I was like, the fuck am I paying like this much rent, and there's no amenities here? I went down to LA because my buddy had a bedroom that was there, and like for cheap rent. And I was like, sure, I'll go down there. Cheap rent, great. And then that didn't last long. The other roommates were like drug addicts, and I was like, okay, no, I'm not staying here. So it was like it lasted like 2 months. I showed up, and then like after the first like few weeks, I like looked at my contract, and I was like, how quick can I get out of here? So then I like sent the information, and I was like, then I was looking, okay, like California's expensive. Where could I go to cut costs and stuff like this? And I was like looking at one state over, and I was like, maybe Arizona. And then I was thinking a little bit more, and I was like, what if I just like keep going? I was like, I go over to Texas. Texas is a lot of things that I like, guns and everything else. And I was like, let me get over there. So during COVID, I was in Austin, Texas, where there's no such thing as COVID, and everyone's like shoulder to shoulder acting like it's Mardi Gras, like every single, like on a Wednesday night. And I was like, this is the first week I was shocked. I was like, I'm gonna get sick. This is just bad. And then after the second week, I'm like, yeah, I guess we're all just here and everything's fine, whatever. Have a beer.
It turns out that being outdoors it's a thing you can do in a moderate climate. It's a great option.
Yeah, I mean, and at the time, like doing the research or like looking at who are the people dying, it's like elderly and people that are not healthy, and it's like I was going to the gym prior, of course, but once all the gyms had shut down, I just started running, so I was doing like 5 miles a day, audio booking, and I was like that probably the healthiest I'd been in my life because I was like, well, there's nothing else to do, I might as well work on me, kind of thing. So that's what I did.
So, so I had a, a mixed experience with the pandemic, but
Okay.
a lot of it is this plays to Britain's authority and
Yeah. Right.
so this is probably like a couple of weeks into the pandemic. They had just shut down all of the like all of New York City and our at the time, who is universally
Right.
so he gets like shamed on social media with a picture of some like people out in a dog run, which is essentially like a portion of a public park that's gated off so you can take your dog off leash.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Hmm.
this is New York City,
Talk about
and people don't run out of yards here. So, he got trained into saying that this is some kind of a super spreader event because a bunch of people that are outside are just watching the dogs run around. They really outside because
Yeah.
it's the day. So this was part of like delirium that everybody was going through. They didn't really understand how to deal with the crisis. They didn't understand what was going on, and they were just making impulsive decisions. So they're like, "Oh, we'll just close it." So they closed all of the doghouse. Well, I didn't appreciate that, so I started unlocking at least the couple that were close to me. So we'll
Yeah.
just take off the locks every day and toss them. And they started running the locks, and they'd start using parts for like a U-shaped anchor joint with some glue and stuff in it. Take that off and toss it. So this goes on for weeks, and eventually they start trying to weld it shut. So I immediately go to Home Depot and get a battery operated sawzall or an angle guide, and then I start cutting the welds off.
Yeah.
So this goes on another couple, and they're actually just destroying these like 100-year-old gates. I'm like, all right, they're trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and they're trying to move bollards in front of them. We're using swing set equipment to build like a fulcrum and a lever. We're moving 3-ton rocks with them.
Yeah.
She's saying, they're trying to cut the baby down the middle rather than save it. So then I had to change tactics and step through, and I got a buddy of mine to recommend a sign, just a business that was open was still making signs. So we went and did these like plastic and flat signs with these metal grommets in them that you could just rapidly zip tie to stuff. And
Yeah.
the gist of all of them, because they're like 1 foot by 1 foot, and there's some big banners that were like 4 foot by 1 foot that you could see a decent ways out. And the gist of all of them were like, why the dog parks? Because Bill de Blasio hates dogs. Hashtag de Blasio hates dogs. I mean, I happen to live by Charles Park, which is where the mayor's mansion is. So I was putting this up in the mayor's mansion after the staff for the parks department had gone home, but the mayor and his wife would go for walks in the morning before the staff had shown up. So you could see a bunch of signs around the neighborhood that were asking why they hated dogs so much. So
Oh,
that
that's
lasted like
terrific.
2 weeks, and they announced they were going to hold the dog. So,
Really?
His Marriott is open for discussion. But the number one for that story is what kind of dog do you have? So,
You're just really bored in the COVID and it's like, how can I cause damage but not too much damage? And trying to figure things out, right?
well, at one point they had moved like some construction gear over, and like in fact, over 90% of our U.S. construction equipment is commonly keyed to the make and model. Or per se blocking an entrance to a driveway, and you wanted to move it, you would just order all of the keys for everything the city owns, and you might
Uh-huh.
just so there's a lot of this stuff. But yeah, if you shut everything down, it's like, yeah, stuff like
Nice. I love it. That's the hacker ethos. I love it.
that. It doesn't matter what age you are. If you see someone doing something that is wrong, you're probably in trouble.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, I can't raise that enough. Big parts. It's like,
Yeah, like,
it's like, well, I disagree with you. I'm like, it's outdoors. It's literally the
man, after leaving California, I found there's something to be upset about, and if there's not, somebody will make something to be upset about. Quite honestly, they need something to be upset about. Yeah. So, anyways, before we get too political,
no.
um,
California's great. The first
I've
things are mudslides and
well, it's interesting. So, like, I have a
some other
friend.
mudslides
Oh, go
and
ahead.
floods. The, the,
Oh, sorry. Go
the,
ahead.
the, the seasons of California or earthquakes, fires,
The
mudslides.
fires.
We get weather. In the rest of the country, we get weather, they get disasters. So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, there's a whole thing about like the wildfires and like if they're potentially set by like cartels or people that are growing weed illegally, so that way the fire department has to go over there and they don't see the legal operations and stuff like that. But yeah. So I think so. We touched on like a lot of different things, right? Is there anything else that you wanted to address that maybe we didn't bring up? I mean, maybe address is the wrong word. Anything you want to promote or share?
yeah, it's about so.
Hey, free, yeah.
All the thing I could say and recently in some articles, which is I think the IITs, you're gonna see things get worse before they get better.
Okay.
Right now, if you look at the evolution of that space, if you think about the Soviet being like six, so highly specialized, but
Very
literally
specialized.
huge. You had to go after certain PLC, certain software, and like everything just kind of had to work out. Huge intelligence operation. If it happened, we came up recently things like Foxnet and Frosty Goop and which again, who names these things? Why just stop naming
Yeah.
these things? Um, but what you're seeing is was specialized. You're now seeing, hey, let's talk more generic protocols for lots of devices, and let's support functionality across a lot of things. And you're starting to see the techniques are now, it's not, hey, let's go do one thing where there's centrifuge in the direction. It's a wrong way. It's can we incorporate additional tactics and techniques, such as brute forcing passwords, not just knowing what the default is, but can I brute force passwords? Can I do things like Kerberos? Can I start to incorporate traditional techniques from the IT side? Can we let it be a more fully functional campaign going after the IoT and OT side? And I think that's only going to get more and more advanced. And where they've had this kind of natural firewall, just given the obscurity of the devices and how to do it, that has become a lot more generic. And you're starting to see that the blast radius of going after that is
Yeah.
it's huge. And it's getting bigger by the day. And people are figuring out how these things work. The second they start to figure it out, the second it's no longer an obscure device, it's just a device.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's a lot of stuff that is a lot of people to the first point, I think we've gotten comfortable.
Yeah, you good?
Okay. I think we've gotten comfortable ignoring those devices because we've been able to segment them off and just say, oh, it's probably not a thing. And it's a bigger and bigger problem. So I think it's one of the.
Yeah, we've also seen, I mean, like from the adversarial side, like there's the division between like somebody's developing the implant, developing the thing that's the malware itself that's actually gonna live there, and then people that sell the access to specific types of devices or even networks and organizations, right? So hyper specialized like syndicates or groups that are focusing on one or two parts of the staging, right? So it makes sense that the extent of that landscape is going to increase while criminal threat actors are segmenting different operations and stuff like that. So.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be, not to say emerging, because it's like these devices have been there for years, but a lot of people don't realize that folks that operate these things often. So like, the people that set them up are like industrial engineers. They come in and they design free or design a water filtration like facility. And then the people who have to operate them are given a screen with buttons. And they're telling what buttons
Yeah.
to hit, but they don't know what the
Yeah.
programming. So it's definitely a bigger problem. I think most people are kind of ready for. And I think CISO has done a lot. I'm pretty wary to where CISO goes. I feel there's in the future of, does it get dismantled? Does it, double down on its original mission around cybersecurity and infrastructure? Do they try to depoliticize the election components? Like, there's a lot of ways that can go, and I think they've made some progress. But I, I think the critical infrastructure side, there definitely needs to be a lot more put into that critical stuff. Because, like, I always thought it was a problem until I got under the hood with some of this stuff. I did not realize how absolutely uh, just to.
Beautiful. Well, I'm excited to see that you're going to help out with the cybersecurity industry by solving the solutions and stuff like that, because like we were just expressing, it's going to only grow. Thank you so much for your time, John. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, going through everything and learning more about your journey, how you got into cybersecurity, the different types of industries that you've been through, and the challenges that you've had as a CISO as your career has gone. One more other question I usually like to ask before wrapping things up is any books that you're either reading now or had a massive impact on you when you were developing yourself as an individual?
That's a good question. I think off the top of my head, if there's anything that, there's the traditional, like the C programming language and things like that you read that are kind of foundational technical.
Yeah, you got the good technical. Dennis Ritchie.
Yeah.
OG.
Like modern operating systems, organization design. Like, some people go through kind of plateaus of knowledge. And if you took it off the way that I did, you didn't get all of those foundations first. You played catch up with them later. And until you kind of broke through that next plateau to know what you didn't know, you might not have known that's existed. But um, to quote Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, and he used to say this a lot when that you should maintain to be a constant limits, and one about just be a voracious reader and try to consume as much information as possible. I think some of the things that have helped me the most in my career, I mean, other than just taking some wild chances at times, which, but one of the things is to just be consuming as much information, especially with things that might be tangential to kind of the core that you're working on. So cybersecurity, that's the technical side. You should deep knowledge of that, but be aware of it with interest rates and the startup world, what's going on with politics and geopolitical events. You'll find that a lot of those have overrealized. And you'll also
Right.
find that you can have some meaningful context on things. Did politics change in 2015 because of the Obama administration, or because of the economics behind the Chinese military like cyber contractors? Like, there's a lot of options there, but does that matter to your board when, like, these are all things that like can help frame the context of why something. And
Huh?
I think that's the important skill. And make sure as you're consuming as much information as possible, make sure you read and or watch the same news every morning that your boss says. This is one that is safe. So my boss is special in financial services, predominantly would watch either CNBC or Bloomberg TV. So when they're eating breakfast and going to the gym in the morning, all that, I know that's the content that they are consuming. So I
Yeah.
better be consuming it too. Because the second there is one cybersecurity topic that comes up on any of those shows, you will get a question about it, and you better know what it's going to be. Because it's not going to be the thing that you're actually worried about. It's the thing that they're worried about because they saw it on TV. So if you're not worried about deep fakes, but it comes up on like CNBC, you better be up to speed on what's going on with this deep fakes.
Yeah, right. That's some really good advice. Yeah, I'm gonna share that with my audience, and I hope everyone takes a, what do you call it? They take a lesson out of that book, or what was the phrase? I don't know. Take a, yeah, you got it. Take a page out of the book. All right. Well, thank you so much again for joining us, John. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I hope to, how do you say? I hope to see you again and see you grow as you're going through this company and see what great things that you produce next.
Well, thanks, man. And I appreciate you having This is a long form podcast.
Yeah, we'll do. We'll wrap it up now, but we chat a little bit after this as well. Tell you how it works. All right, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks,